Start with a size reference to match real desert dunes. The maximum height shouldn't exceed 50 to 60 meters. Scale this cube accordingly and add a plane for the desert landscape. Also, scale the plane to a large number that fits your vision of the scene. In my case, it's 2 square kilometers. Adjust your view distance in the viewport and for your camera for larger landscapes. To create dunes, you could use pure displacement maps, but it's more accurate to increase the geometry of your plane and use Blender's built-in procedural texture displacement to generate dunes. Add a subdivision surface modifier and choose a high number, for example 10, and add the displacement modifier below. Select New and click the icon to access the texture field. Choose Distorted Noise with Voronoi F1 for the noise basis and Blender Original for the distortion option. Increase the size to a high number, such as 400. Decrease the number of subdivisions and add another one, lastly to smooth out the tips of the dunes. Also subdivide the plane in edit mode slightly to rise some parts and create a more natural look for the terrain. Let's add an HDRI for realistic lighting and texture to the desert. I used Quixel Bridge to implement textures, assets and more into my projects. Simply download the assets you want and after importing they are copied directly to your Blender project. Materials are also set up automatically. If you want to know how to make this work, let me know. Unfortunately, the displacement maps are not imported. Select your material, copy and paste the path to your Explorer, drag it into the material now, and you are good to go. You won't see any difference until you switch the feature set to experimental to access adaptive subdivision. Also switch the displacement mode to displacement and bump. Now Blender generates real geometry accordingly to the distance of your camera. Now create sandstones, pillars and other structures for the abandoned ruins. Basic stones for pyramids and temples are quite large with an average size range of 50 to 200 centimeters. With face snapping enabled, create different sizes and shapes to achieve unique looks. To speed up this process, build your own small asset blocks that fit together. Corners, large and small walls, archways and more should be part of this. For pillars, I used cubes and cylinders. Simply extrude faces and make loop cuts according to your references. Before starting to build the complete ruins, there's a bit more to do to save time in the end. Unwrapping can be painful for complex structures, but for walls like this, press 1 or 3 on your numpad and choose Cube Projection for the facing meshes. Press Ctrl-I to invert the selection in corners, switch the view and choose Cube Projection again. After unwrapping, bevel the edges of each stone with Ctrl-B. A similar workflow applies to the pillars. Cube or cylinder projection is the way I unwrapped my pillars, with some view projection for circular shapes. Match it up in the UV editor. Also remember to bevel the edges. Finally, fix the texture scale and keep your stone walls as a size reference. Now get creative and build your ruins or other historical buildings. I wanted a big abandoned temple ruin with high walls and a huge entrance. For archways, select the top of each side and move the cursor to the center between. Select the spin tool and move it 180 degrees. Fix the offset angle by rotating this axis. And because old abandoned ruins are not perfectly preserved, you can add some damage to them. Remove random stones from the tops of some walls, let pillars fall into ruins and fit the walls where the collision was realized in a natural way. Everything should look a bit collapsed and maybe some parts are missing. Also, old ruins and buildings have sunk into the desert sand. So stick some walls and pillars onto it. Once you've finished the main focus of your scene, start duplicating the ruins with Alt-D if it's geometry heavy, and choose a different rotation for the background. It's an easy way to fill the background without modeling everything again. Sculpt sand onto walls, pillars, and obstacles. Usually sand accumulates more in these places. Create some extra damage and deform your buildings with the displace modifier. Use a new texture, choose distorted noise, and select weight paint mode to add this effect to specific areas. Enhance it with an additional subdivision surface modifier. The pillars still looked too clean for abandoned ruins. Use the cell fracture tool to split an object into pieces. Delete some of these pieces and scale down the original object to make it look like a crumbled surface. Time to paint different areas for grass, debris, and stone lying around. Create different particle systems for each and choose the right vertex group. For the debris, I used some cell fracture pieces, for example. Add a large cube to create some atmosphere with the volume scatter node. To avoid repetitive tiling, mix multiple textures together. I used a noise texture with a color ramp to mix it randomly. More textures give even better results. At this point, I decided to render a test frame. And to be honest, it kind of looks nice, but something still doesn't fit the look I had in my mind. It's not a shame to delete some of your work or change it if you are not happy with it. It's part of the process. So I removed the walls right behind the huge entrance because it didn't make much sense to me now. Instead, I used some parts of it to create a path. With 2 shrink warp modifiers, I snapped them to the ground, create 2 vertex groups, top and bottom side, and use some offset values to keep the shape of your mesh. In the end, I modeled more large temple elements with the same workflow I covered previously. Also, I increased the displacement scale of the pillars to 0.5 to achieve a more demolished look. And here is the final animation.